Hey, Varun, welcome.
Hey, good to meet.
Great. Well, my name is Will. Welcome to the Neo4j live stream. We are joined today by Varun Shenoy. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's
Cool.
perfect.
Cool. Great. So, Varun, you built something called GraphGPT a few months ago, maybe, and we're going to talk about that today. But before we get into that project, I think it'd be interesting for folks maybe to learn a little bit about you and what you work on these days.
Sure, totally. Varun, currently a senior at Stanford in sunny Palo Alto. Um, s- Initially thought I was going to do a PhD, so spent a lot of time doing ML AI research. Spent some time in healthcare after that, and been kind of exploring for the past year or so. This whole kind of GPT craze happened. I've just been working on a lot of projects, not only on large language models, but also on diffusion. So
Hmm.
I've been doing a lot of things with kind of like logo generation using diffusion, but also figure out how do you get these models to be smaller and smaller so you can run them locally, which has been a lot of fun.
Gotcha. Cool. So maybe if there's a chance that some folks aren't familiar with what GPT is, what LLMs are, what diffusion models are, maybe could you just give us like a little overview of what some of those concepts are?
Yeah, totally. So GPT stands for, I believe, Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Um, but it's basically this model that came out from OpenAI, and it's a language model, which means that given text, it can respond back with text. So it's kind of this like holy grail of artificial intelligence where you can actually communicate with it in a weird way, or it can like make sense of text and respond back in text. And uh, these language models, the architecture behind the language model, the transformer, uh, it's basically they're all just neural networks. If you're familiar with that, very special kinds of neural networks that can kind of respond to text. Um, and GPT was just very, very good. When GPT-3 came out, it got better and better. And GPT-4 recently came out; it's incredibly good. And ever since, like the large language model space got very crowded, lots of different people building cool stuff here. Um, and they're called large language models because once they get to a certain size, the number of weights, the number of parameters inside these really massive functions that are supposed to model language, um, they start to do very, very interesting things. They have kind of these properties, they're usually called emergent, that can do pretty funny things, reason through tasks, summarize text, write code even. And that's kind of what the craze with like chat GPT and so on has been on. They're all kind of built on top of this fundamental technology called LLMs.
Cool. So it seems to me like I don't know AI and generative AI specifically. So like large language models and the diffusion model for generating images that you mentioned earlier. Seems like this is really blew up all of a sudden. It seems like maybe what, like 6 months ago, maybe. What was in your mind kind of the, I don't know, like the tipping point? What was it, GPT or Chat GPT specifically that kind of made people realize what may be possible with this kind of technology? Like what is it? I guess do you think made this so uh, important for everyone to sort of dig into in the last few months?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I spent a lot of time, um, even last year before Chat GPT, just playing with GPT-3, and it was pretty incredible coming up with prose. I think that was the part that really impressed me, right? Like you're able to get it to write essays or emails in a certain tone. And that's very fundamentally different than what was possible with kind of previous robot AI assistants. I think a Siri, right? Not nearly as useful or interesting or creative. Um, and I think the world was kind of itching for a reason to use it. like for me and my friends who were playing around with it, you'd have to go into the OpenAI playground, just like this developer environment. It's a little bit intimidating if you've never played with it before. It's just a blank text box, and you have to write a prompt, and it'll answer it. But how do you structure this prompt? How do you like do all these things? There's so many questions that actually hinder you from actually seeing how powerful it is. And then Chat GPT came out, right? And like I think the general consensus is anyone could have built Chat GPT around the GPT API, but OpenAI happened to do it. And that was kind of a productization of the technology. If you go to Chat GPT and there's this really fine text at the bottom of the chat box that says free research preview. So even they didn't expect it to blow up as much as it did. But fundamentally, it provided a user experience and interface that enabled anyone who didn't want to go into the playground or just had to create, you just had to create an account. You could start chatting and kind of examine the power of these models. And initially it was really bad. Like everyone remembers, like, or maybe people don't, but for like the first week it was terrible. But they were able to curate and collect data. It's this really beautiful data flywheel that allows you to train the model and get better results, right? Every time there's a response, you can thumbs up or thumbs down it. And then that's kind of a bit of reinforcement for the algorithm to decide whether it should make responses like that again for others or not. And it just got very, very good very quickly, and everyone was hooked.
So sort of the combination of this amazing underlying technology, which is GPT, LLMs, but packaging that in a way through this chat interface that you didn't have to be a developer. Anyone could access this. It's like you're chatting in a text message thread, right? That was really, I think, key to bring the potential to everyone to sort of see this, I think. Cool.
Yeah,
well,
100% agree.
Cool. So scrolling through your Twitter feed, which maybe we can link here, is pretty amazing because it looks like you've been building lots of experimental things, I guess, just kind of pushing the limits of what's possible with various types of technology, sort of incorporated with AI. You've got, for example, the Merlin text editor for kind of improving your text, GraphGPT, which we're going to talk about. You also blog a bit. I was reading your post basically where you were sort of getting at this idea of why we should experiment more and build more experimental things. Could you talk a bit about, like, what's maybe your motivation, your inspiration for building these things? Like, how do you come up with these ideas for what to build?
Yeah, totally. I think there's like two kind of things, right? I think the first one is, especially in this world of kind of GPT, it's really easy to iterate really quickly. I think like general consensus when you're building is you have to go out there and like figure out if people actually like your idea or not. It's like kind of this very opinionated thing where you want to kind of get in front of people and see if this makes sense or not. But it is so quick to iterate and build magical experiences right now that you can skip that entire process. Like in the time it takes for you to do, however many conversations or thinking required, you could build like 10 different tools that are each kind of interesting, maybe not super useful, but you at least get feedback and contact with reality. So that's the first thing. I'd say the second thing is just kind of a lot of fun, right? Because of the speed, one kind of downstream effect is if you come up with something really silly or something that you're just curious about, you can just try it out, right? And there's like no harm, no foul. Maybe people find it interesting, maybe people don't. I think my general belief is it's really hard to guess what people will find interesting for the most part, other than just trying and going and doing it, creating mock-ups, or just creating a full-fledged application people can play with by putting in their OpenAI API key, and then just putting it out there for people to try. I think that was the case with GraphGPT. Did not expect people to like it as much as they did, but I had fun kind of prodding and seeing if it was possible. I could have sat around thinking about it for a while, but I think just kind of being the first person to experiment with it and get it out there and see if people like it was super important. As far as like inspiration for ideas, I think it's just kind of day to day. I'm like, oh, this really sucks. Maybe I could use like language models to do this. And I think it helps that I'm at Stanford and surrounded by a whole community of friends who are like thinking in very, very similar ways.
Gotcha. Cool. Makes a lot of sense. Well, let's let's dig into GraphGPT and talk a bit about what it is, how you built it, any sort of reactions that you had.
Mhm.
Could you maybe give us a demo of it so we're all sort of understanding what it
Yeah,
is we're talking
totally.
about? Cool.
Absolutely. We'll go ahead and pull that up.
I notice it seems like most of your apps are hosted on Vercel, which I'm a big fan
Hmm.
of. That
Yep,
kind of gives you that very smooth developer experience for
exactly.
hosting and building these kinds of things. Nice to see.
Okay. Can you see the GraphGPT?
Yes, gotcha.
Okay, sweet. So I've already put in my API key right here. And the goal of GraphGPT is to take any sort of large amounts of unstructured text and automatically add structure to it through the form of a graph. You can go here, go to kind of Star Wars Wikipedia page. It was recently May 4th, so I think it makes a lot of sense. Let's just grab some text from the plot here, copy it, and use that as our description for the graph. I'm gonna probably wait a little bit for this to load. Um,
And so what you copied text from Wikipedia describing
mhm,
like the plot of a
just the plot.
movie
Hmm.
essentially, and then you hit this generate button. And what's happening behind the scenes right now?
Yeah. So the text that's been put here, the plot, gets fed into GPT basically through the form of a prompt, right? So it's not just that text, but there's kind of a decorator around it that says, "Hey, you're designing a graph. Here's an example of what a graph looks like. Now go ahead and try and make a graph using this information," right? And it sometimes comes with artifacts. Like you see this Alice and Bob thing right here. That's not in the plot. There's no Alice and Bob in Star Wars, but it is kind of part of the prompt because you're trying to. I'm giving it a lot of examples of what graphs might look like, right? So you can generate it properly. But as you can see, there's you can see a ton of information right here uh, about Star Wars. Let's see, right? You got or a couple of different components. And sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense, but a lot of times it's just very cool that like a lot of these relations are true. And as kind of these models get better, uh, these graphs will probably get better. And probably if you improve the prompting for your specific use case, that'd be better and more helpful as well, right? You can also add additional features. So you can say like Han Solo is friends with Luke Skywalker. And then let that go for a second, and it automatically creates that connection right there.
This is amazing. This is super cool. So now we have what like a knowledge graph view of basically the plot of this movie generated from the text, essentially, right?
Yeah, yeah, and there are like a ton of issues that you probably want to go solve, right? You kind of have Princess Leia here, and you have Leia here, right? And those are actually the same entity. So it has sometimes trouble realizing that it already has seen an entity, and that's because of certain things I've done in the prompt to optimize speed. But there are ways to write the prompt that'll take quite a bit longer, but will give you better results.
Gotcha. Interesting. So what you've talked about this concept of a prompt a few times, and maybe for folks who haven't used GPT, like a prompt is some instruction to GPT to to do what? To sort of prepare GPT to answer a question or process some text. Like what exactly is a prompt?
Yeah. So multiple ways to kind of answer that, right? And I think it helps to look at what language models are historically. Historically, they're just text completers. They just predict the next word. And what this means is if you have a base language model, it's not GPT, they might call it like base GPT, or if you see any model and then like hyphen base, that means it's not tuned for instructions. It's purely used for predicting the next word, right? So if I ask it a question like, what color are elephants? It'll say gray, but then it'll have this kind of stochastic behavior where it says, what color are giraffes? What color are lions? Right? So it just tries to predict the next word, and it kind of assumes that there's a lot of very similar information coming back to back. It doesn't really understand what a question is or what an instruction is, because realistically, in terms of like words, there's not that much difference between like a question or like a paragraph or whatever. But if you give it like a half-baked paragraph, it'll try and complete the rest, and that might be useful. And what OpenAI and a bunch of other people do is they take this base model and they fine tune it on human instruction, right? So you get a bunch of question and answer from like a data set, right? So this could be using people's chat GPT responses. This could be like the Databricks DALL-E data set that they collected from all of their employees. There's a lot of different instruction tuning data sets. You can tune the model on those instructions. Now the question becomes, how do you describe an instruction in a way to the model that gets you the output that you're looking for? And that's prompting, right? And there's a lot of theses on prompting, like will prompting be around? Is prompting really good for a lot of people? Maybe it makes sense in chat. Maybe in a lot of other cases it doesn't. But I think it's very much an open question with respect to like user interface design.
Gotcha. Could you tell us about a little more about the prompt that you use to generate this graph to extract these relationships?
So if you could go to the GitHub repo for GraphGPT, you can actually see all the code that's being done here, right? So let's see. So we're querying, we have two prompts. I think you should, if you have time, look into both of them because they're pretty interesting, right? So the way I currently use prompts is I kind of have a text file with a dot prompt, and then I do a bunch of things like replacing the prompt with the user's query, for example. So this is like what the user has passed in through the little text box. So you have the stateless and we have the stateful. Let's take a look at the stateless first. So this is the prompt for stateless, right? And how this works is we treat the LLM kind of like a computer or a programmer, actually, that can pass kind of a instruction set or a set of instructions to the front end, the client, who then executes instructions, right? So you provide these kind of KG triples, and there's some other features as well, but really this is like the main bread and butter of the prompt. And then we give it one example, right? So you saw that kind of weird hallucination of Alice and Bob. Alice is Bob's roommate, make her node green, and I give an example of what I'd want the output to be. Well, there's really, you can decompose that into two instructions. One, we want this KG triple between Alice and Bob, and the fact that they're roommates, and we want to make Alice this certain color. And this gets sent to my front end, and the front end can parse that out and see what that means, right? And then we take in the user's prompt, which could be, the entire first couple of paragraphs of the plot of Star Wars. That can go here, and then we kind of create this kind of label title for updates, colon, and then we just try and get it to finish what it expects to come next. So we expect to see something similar to this, since we've already given it an example. And the reason I call this stateless is because it's incredibly fast. You just look into all the relationships and you just kind of turn them out very quickly, and you don't have to worry about the graph structure at all. And this is why you run into issues such as having separate entities for Leia and Princess Leia. You can fix this by using a stateful prompt, which, although works much better, is much slower. And instead of kind of giving instructions, you actually try to generate the entire JSON blob for the graph. So given the current state of graph in the prompt, extrapolate as many relationships as possible. And every node is ID, label, and color. Every edge is a to and from, and edges are directed. And you give it an example of what a current state might look like. You give it an update through a prompt, and then you create a new state, right? So now there's kind of a stateful nature to the prompt. You take the current state of the graph. It might be an empty graph, but it also might be a graph that already has things. And then it takes a prompt. This could be, you could have the state from what we just had, the first Star Wars movie, and we can give it the second Star Wars movie, and update and pass that in as a prompt, and it'll update the state accordingly. We can also ask it to delete nodes or edit nodes, which you can't really do. You can with some additional prompting on the stateless one, but at least for the stateful one, you can do it right away. It's just much slower because you now have to spit out all these different tokens for this entire graph.
Gotcha. That's interesting. So looking at these prompts, this, especially the first one, I guess this is much shorter than what I was expecting. I guess I was expecting you would have to be much more explicit in what you're trying to accomplish here. But I guess, as you say, it's really all about that idea of predicting what comes next. And so because you've left off at sort of updates, the thing that's going to come next is GPT filling in the updates based on the examples you provided, which is what there's basically just one example here, right? And so GPT from that one example is able to infer what it needs to do for the entire graph, which is pretty amazing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's just, there are multiple ways, right? I think a lot of the folks at OpenAI say that if you use, for example, GPT 3.5, which is incredibly fast, and you provide a very detailed prompt. So if I take this prompt and just make it a lot more detailed, maybe not provide any examples, it'll do very well. But I imagine if you kind of run this through GPT-4 right now without the example, it might do decent. It's just, we might have a hard time being able to parse apart the formatting from the client side, which is why kind of showing an example is so important. So there's some kind of determinism in expectation of what we're going to get, and be able to read it and turn it into something that we can graphically show, since it's not just text.
Gotcha. How, I guess, maybe let's talk about this. So you mentioned GPT-4 and GPT 3.5. GPT-4 is, currently I think there's a wait list for GPT-4. Have you used GPT-4 yet?
Yeah, I have. It's great. It's a little slow, but it's really good.
Is it sort of, how would you compare it to GPT-3? Is it sort of an incremental improvement or like a complete game changer?
Yeah.
How would you think about that?
Yeah. So there's GPT-3, which was pretty good. Then there was 3.5 Turbo, which is basically better than 3, but kind of super fast, like really fast. And then there's 4, and generally nowadays I pretty much only use 4. 3 is still good, and 3 is still faster than 4. It's just that you'd rather use kind of 3.5 or Turbo than 3, because it's about the same quality-wise. But 4 can be very thoughtful. It can write things much better. It doesn't repeat phrases. So one kind of heuristic thing that would happen with GPT-3 and 3.5 is it repeats phrases over and over again, right? You can ask it to write some code or write like a passage, and there'll be like some words that kind of make it sound like it was written by a machine. GPT-4 doesn't do that. GPT-4 is better than at math and arithmetic as well, which is really strange. You can take like averages of numbers, which if you consider how these language models work is really odd. Like if you're predicting the next token, it's absurd that you'd be able to calculate, for example, an average. What else can GPT-4 do that GPT-3 can't do? Yeah, just like understanding things with less context and reducing kind of the grunt of the work that the prompt has to do, which has been really fun to kind of explore and poke around with. And then there's the whole plugin ecosystem that they're trying to foster as well. So I haven't been able to try yet, but I think it's very exciting.
Oh, right. Maybe could you describe what the plugin ecosystem is?
Yeah, so the vision is if you build ChatGPT, which is this consumer application that everyone loves, and maybe there's like an enterprise version that's coming out as well. I think they did announce that actually. It makes a lot of sense to kind of have plugins that work on top, because you don't only want chat. You want to be able to browse. You want to be able to run code. It'd be very cool if you can kind of edit a video just through kind of textual commands instead of having to open up iMovie or Final Cut Pro, right? So that's kind of the idea. a lot of people working on projects like this using GPT, this idea of agents, where you kind of get LLMs to autonomously go complete a task. But OpenAI just said, hey, like we actually have the distribution channels for these kinds of products, so we can just bake them into ChatGPT because people are coming to ChatGPT anyways. Might as well give them access to all these additional features.
Gotcha. Interesting. So I could potentially have ChatGPT make reservations for me at a restaurant or book travel or something like that through some plugin with I don't know the flight operator or something like that is how that would work.
Exactly.
Interesting. Cool. It sounds like a lot of opportunities here for fun experiments going forward. We have a few questions in the chat, so maybe we can go through some of these now. If that sounds good. So
Sounds good.
Saksham is asking, what language is this written in? I think he's asking about the actual web app that we were looking at for GraphGPT earlier. That looked like, was that a React application?
Yeah, just React and JavaScript, kind of like very, very bare bones, very simple. Yeah, just to kind of showcase how much power GPT itself has. Yeah.
So you're basically, I guess the functionality of the web app that you build, if I'm looking at it, it's basically taking some input from the user and then making a network request to the ChatGPT API, and then that data comes back. So when you were using the stateful prompt, you're getting back a JSON object from
You're getting back exactly what the graph looks like. So you can just inject that into kind of the graph view.
And is that the case for the stateless prompt as well? You get back a JSON object.
You don't get a JSON object, you get kind of a list of lists, which is why I think it's more interesting to view it as kind of a program, like a DSL, or domain specific language. And the idea is then it's much easier and cheaper to generate that because it's less tokens. You're pretty much only generating the relationships that you found and none of this kind of miscellaneous tokens that you have associated with the JSON blob. No separate like edge list and set of nodes, just kind of raw exactly what's coming out from the text. So you actually have to do have to parse it on the client side and convert it to JSON. But that's much cheaper and much faster than letting GPT run off and do that.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And then, so we get back this data and we want to visualize that as a graph. How are you rendering that graph view? Is that a graph visualization library, and how does that piece work?
It's some component library. I can tell you. I don't know off the top of my head.
Is it
yeah,
Viz.js
React Graph
maybe?
is
React
it's just
Graph
some
okay.
package called React Graph is. Yeah, it was just like very simple to use and plug in. But I don't know how much, if it had much customizability at all.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, the world of graph visualization is very fun. There's lots of different libraries out there to. It seems like they're all optimized for different things for working with graph visualization. Cool. So here's a question from Sachin who's asking, in the prompt, there's a very simple relationship. So that your example of that was Alice and Bob, I think. How does GPT extrapolate that to more complex relationships, or does it?
I'm not like quite sure what that means, right? Like I think in this Star Wars plot. Oh, this is talking about like the single K shot, the one shot example. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's not so much extrapolating it to more complex relations per se from that prompt. It's more so the reason I show that K shot is that example is to describe how to format the output, less so than like what the actual output is, because I have to parse the output. If you let the model run without an example, it'll give you a pretty decent result. It's just your client side might not be able to parse what comes out the other end. Just it's more so that it's not so much like I'm teaching it to find relationships. It kind of knows how to do that from the prompt.
Gotcha. So it knows how to sort of work with the text, but the example is really for the format. That's interesting. Okay, cool. Um, Another question from Sachin. Have you tried any open source GPTs like Llama? Can these be trained to work at the same level as GPT 3.5?
Uh, yeah, it's a good question. I have. I think it sort of probably no right now. I don't think anyone's found them to work nearly as well. Um, but I think it's mostly a data problem. I think like open source LMs will happen. It's just a question of kind of open source orgs or companies getting enough data, training these models to be optimal, and then actually releasing them with some kind of like Apache 2 license that's okay
Mm.
for like commercial and educational use. I think it's a lot of people are probably already using like really small models that work really well out in the industry. It just doesn't make sense for like OpenAI to do it. So it's like someone has to do it, right? And like Llama's okay, like it's not great. I still like switching from like GPT to Llama's like I could be talking to a very smart person, but I'm choosing to talk with like a child instead.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. From Andreas, do you think this could work with GPT-2 and the downloaded pre-trained model?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't tried it. I think could work. I do think it was like a fundamental kind of shift in like what GPT-3 was able to do. But might be worth trying out. I do think like finding relationships in unstructured data, it does seem to be an emergent property uh, that I like talked about earlier. It's able to do these very strange things that humans can do. And it's still kind of imperfect with GPT-3. Like if you scrutinize the graph that pops up, a lot of issues, right? It's cool at a high level. You can fix a lot of them. So it's a really, really good starting point, which I think is what these language models are real killers for. It gets you to your first draft super quickly, but there's still a whole plethora of issues. And I just have a hunch that GPT-2 wouldn't be able to do it, but it's probably worth trying.
How so let's set aside GPT and in the world prior to GPT, let's say you wanted to build this graph GPT application. So going from natural text to knowledge graph representation, how would you build that? And how much more difficult would that be without GPT?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like this has been an open problem for like a really, really long time. Being able to automatically take text and convert it into kind of a knowledge graph, right? Like I think a lot of like ontologies, a lot of like um, anywhere where you're trying to kind of decipher relationships automatically between things, whether it's in biology, econ, like pretty much in every field, there's some kind of graphical representation that you can create. Um, and it was just always a pain, right? Like there have been companies built around figuring out how to do this. Um, and you'd have to go kind of with a very heuristic approach, probably use kind of sentence structure and verb tense and kind of named entity recognition. So kind of really not super old, but kind of like Python, NLTK, NLP stuff to really infer stuff. And you probably won't get as good as GPT at the end. Um,
Hmm.
it's pretty fascinating because like before these large language models, whenever you wanted to do any machine learning task, whether that was sentiment analysis or document structuring or kind of summarization, you'd have to train an entirely separate model to do it. But now it's like all one API call away,
Hmm.
which makes, it just collapses a lot of different problems into a very simple, similar structure.
Is that so? That's interesting. This idea of having like narrowly focused models for specifically what you're trying to accomplish. And I, I've played around more with things like in the stable diffusion, like image generation and like
Yeah,
LoRa models, text inversion, like these kinds of
yeah,
things where you have like one little model that's kind of adding maybe like a better way to fix the eyes or faces in image generation. What is sort of the equivalent of that in the like LLM GPT world? Are you able to train sort of like additional little add-on models that maybe have like a lot of domain knowledge, or is that necessary with GPT?
Yeah, so I think like there's really bad naming conventions in kind of the GPT world versus the diffusion world. So there is fine tuning. I think fine people when they say fine tuning, they have no idea what they're talking about. At the end of the day, it doesn't actually help instill knowledge or like do more interesting stuff. It's kind of like style transfer. So if you fine tune on a bunch of Shakespeare text, like it'll start talking like Shakespeare. That's about it. That's all that fine tuning does. The issue that we haven't seen kind of these add-on and modules in the LLM space is because there's nothing open source to work with. So if you actually look into the llama and alpaca stuff, it's the exact same. There's LoRa, there's obviously fine tuning, there's uh, what else? There's just like a whole slew of different approaches that are being explored in open source. And the reason the stable diffusion stuff works is because it's open source and people can experiment and play with it. But if you can imagine if stable diffusion was owned by one company, like you don't get access to LoRa's in Midjourney. Um,
Right.
so you don't get them in GPT either. But if you want to run stuff on your own and play with it, um, yeah, there's a lot of interesting work. Like I was reading recently, people were like building um, so llama or alpaca, they're inherently kind of censored. They're not really base models because they're trained on GPT data, like shared GPT data. So it ends up saying things like, as an AI assistant programmed by OpenAI, and stuff like that. That's very kind of um, learned. So people have been able to build LoRa's to kind of like uncensor it, or build LoRa's to train it to talk in a certain style, and try and figure out how can you reverse engineer the base model, for example.
Gotcha. Interesting. So when you're thinking about like knowledge graphs and LLMs, like this graph GPT example is great because I think it shows the power of graph visualization to kind of understand a situation or a body of talks, right? To kind of like grok the situation visually, like just looking at those two examples, like a Wikipedia page versus the graph visualization, I can understand a lot more quickly looking at the graph visualization than I can reading, say, like the Wikipedia page, right? Um, which is really neat. But like, I guess what's next, or how else do you see knowledge graphs and large language models interacting? Is there something uh, interesting going forward out there? Like, I guess, how do you see those two working together going forward?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's super interesting because now you can collapse any text into a knowledge graph. Like it's not perfect fidelity, but it's pretty good and it's better than what you could get before. And generally, from a knowledge graph, there's like a couple added benefits, right? It's easier to traverse for a human, right? Like table of contents are basically kind of a graph structure on top of a textbook
Hmm.
describing where things are. You can do that for any document, like in the limit, create some kind of graph, right? It's easier for humans to kind of examine, but I think more interestingly, it's easier for agents to understand and query, right? So if you want an LM to go out and do some kind of autonomous work, it has a very limited context window, at least right now, and probably for a while. Like even if you use GPT-4 32K, that might not be enough for some use cases. Um, but if you have a graph representation, you can kind of have a start node, like in this knowledge, and then it can decide at each step which nodes to collect, and then based on the most important nodes it kind of finds in this traversal, it can then answer the question rather than having to like stuff a lot of text into the prompt or doing some kind of less optimal embedding based approach.
Gotcha. Okay. So some opportunities there maybe for like machine readable knowledge graphs, or knowledge
Yeah,
graphs are more machine readable than text, essentially, I guess
yeah, like
is what
machine
you're getting at.
readable is like kind of a funny word now, right? Because anything can be
That's
machine
true.
readable.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Interesting. Okay. Cool. Well, should we talk more about GraphGPT? I'd love to also like dig into some of your other projects, or I have a ton of questions to ask you too. But do you want to go deeper on GraphGPT, or what do you think?
Uh, I think covered pretty much everything in GraphGPT. I don't know
Cool.
if there's much more ground to touch, but happy to chat
Cool.
about either.
Well, can we talk about some of the other projects that you worked on then, and
Sure,
maybe
absolutely.
uh, maybe let me preface this by asking, like, of um, these sort of experimental projects that you've put out, what has had the biggest or maybe the most surprising reception so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think generally, uh, it's very simple to kind of come up with these ideas, and then you can iterate pretty quickly on them, right? I think take some like X idea and then just see, can you like make it powered by GPT? Actually, I think the example you brought, Merlin, was
Hmm.
pretty interesting, right? I was just curious, could you create a better text editor? But I think it's like a little bit more nuanced than that. There have been a lot of text editors that have come out in the last couple of months built on top of GPT, right? There's this idea that with GPT, you can just kind of auto generate text. So why write at all, right? And I actually think and then there's like a ton of startups that are building things like this, like note taking tools, like Microsoft Word drop ins and replacements. I just think it's like fundamentally flawed. I think it's much harder to edit AI written text than just writing the essay yourself. Um, and generally speaking, I think it's bad to like let LMs do a lot of writing for you because it kind of can dilute the intrinsic character that you might be trying to describe. It might start using the same vocabulary over and over again, can get repetitive. And I think sort of more abstractly, you kind of lose your own voice, which I think matters more in this increasing world of generative content. So the whole idea behind Merlin was, okay, so this is a text editor. It's just like a really dumb markdown editor. So you can just write text, but you can also highlight text. The LM isn't going to go do writing for you, but it can provide you with edits. And I think it's a really interesting interface pattern because when you're writing an essay, you don't want someone doing the writing for you. You don't go run to someone and say, hey, like, can you finish this paragraph for me? No, it's more like, can you read over this paragraph and explain how it can be done better? And that way you kind of get to keep some kind of the structure that you already had in place and you don't lose your train of thought. And it comes back with a bunch of advice. It reads over your thing and says, hey, maybe you should swap out these words, maybe rephrase this, provide some examples here. And you can go ahead and do that yourself. But there's also this magic fix button that once you hit it, it goes ahead and takes that sort of highlighted text and those edits and tries and applies them automatically. Shows you kind of like a git diff in like that like pops up and says, this is what the LM thinks you should write, or the LM has done the replacement that it said you should do for you. And you can kind of accept or approve or accept or reject. Right? And I think that's a much better modality than kind of using chat GPT to write like a memo. Just because it wouldn't sound as interesting.
Right.
So I think like thinking of interfaces of if we think of LMs as co-authors or co-pilots or whatever, what does that actually mean? Does that mean chat? I don't think it means chat, right? It totally depends on what you're doing. Um, you want someone who can like read your text or read your code and point at the screen and tell you what to do, not just kind of like a customer agent bot that sits in the corner of your screen and can ask you questions. I think things are a much higher modality than that. And depends entirely on the task. I think for a lot of tasks, chat is fine, but there are a lot of tasks where chat isn't optimal.
Yeah, I think being able to keep the human in the loop of these AI systems, you're able to sort of leverage human intuition and all of these things, plus take advantage of the AI features, right? I had
Exactly.
tried several of those like blog post generating tools last year when I was just curious, and the ones that I found that were the best had this sort of incremental process of you start with a topic and first it generates bullet points for you and gives you the ability to like regenerate the bullet own, and then it goes to sort of generating the main points and then filling in the text and so on. And so as you say, it's not just write my entire blog post for me, it's sort of guiding you and sort of helping you fill in the gaps as you're going through that process.
Yeah,
Cool.
I think like the
So
granularity is super important. Mhm.
totally, totally, yeah. So another project that I saw that caught my eye was Health GPT, where you were
Mhm.
taking some data on device, like on an iPhone, and sort of being able to uh, use that data to ask questions of like your health activities and things like this. Could you talk a bit about that one?
Yeah, totally. I think like the question we were trying to pose there was, so ChatGPT plugins are coming out and like everyone's gonna have access to them really quickly. And plugins end up only being useful when the data for that plugin is readily accessible, right? If you want to edit a video, you have to have that video file. You can kind of drag and drop and get it edited. Well, if you wanted to do that for your healthcare data, like your step count, your sleep hours, your heart rate, how would you even do that, right? Like you wear an Apple Watch, and you carry your iPhone everywhere, and you track your sleep. How do I actually get that data into ChatGPT, um, and get it to analyze it? Well, you can export your data, you could airdrop it to your laptop, and then drag it to ChatGPT, but that just seems like a lot of work. So I think a lot of the time, a good approach here is to figure out where the data and information is sitting and then kind of build the chat GPT plugin on that platform. So the idea was basically just build kind of a GPT wrapper that's locally sitting on iOS and can easily get access to all of your health kit data through the Apple provided SDK. And that's exactly what I was able to do. Just grab information from the health app, and then be able to run different analyses on it and answer basically natural language questions. And in a weird way, chat is not a bad interface for this because it's like you're talking to kind of a trainer, which is a lot of fun.
Interesting. Cool. Yeah, I like that. I like that idea. Yeah, this idea. I guess what you're pointing out too is like a lot of our most sensitive data lives on device. So health data, Apple, I think is very sensitive to this idea of, oh, we want to keep as much of this data on device. Of course, we can sync it optionally. You can integrate optionally with third party things like heart rate monitors, Strava, these kinds of things. But when it comes to like analyzing this data, um, I think this is something you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. You're interested in like smaller models that can run on device. I think that's maybe a core difference between the way, say, like Apple approaches AI with trying to do things on device and keeping your sensitive data on device versus with GPT, we're interacting through an API. So all of everything goes to some central OpenAI API server, right? Do you think um, do you think that this on-device machine learning is evolving as rapidly as the like LLM space in general? Like I haven't seen much about what's going on with sort of like on-device AI recently. Like what does that look like these days?
Yeah, I'm actually like working on a couple things here, but uh, it's really really difficult because, like I mentioned before, uh, it's expensive to train these things, right? I think some Mosaic ML, which is kind of one of the leading LLM companies out now, they help you basically create LLMs for your own company. They launched MPT, which is their version of GPT, is like Mosaic Pre-trained Transformer, and just to train a 7 billion parameter model, which they made commercially available. It's like open source; anyone can use it, which is really really cool. They spent like 250K or some ridiculous amount like that. So the question is like, can open source like find that much money and be able to train things with as high fidelity and kind of curate the data sets needed? There's a lot of weird copyright issues that maybe open source is just not as well posed as like a corporation to be dealing with right now. Figuring out which data sets have copyrighted material, which ones don't, right? There's this really odd thing in diffusion where some of these models end up with big Shutterstock or Getty Images
Yeah.
logos, right? And it, there's a lot of like legal questions. Um, but as far as kind of like on device, on prem, I think is interesting as well. We're not anywhere near GPT quality. It seems like OpenAI, Google, they're probably a year or two ahead at a minimum. But that kind of makes me hopeful. Like I think the space moves fast enough. People are interested enough that I think stuff will start being built. It's just you can't build as flashy things as you can with GPT, with like Llama, for example. You just can't. And that's probably a fundamental limitation, the fact that a 3 billion or 7 billion parameter model stands no chance at a 180 billion parameter model, or the limit like Google's Palm, like 540 billion parameters. And they're probably launching an API for that, right? Yeah.
Gotcha. So related to this, last week, or yeah, I think this was last week, there was a leaked memo from was it Google talking about how they don't really have a
no
moat. Yeah, yeah. What's your take on that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Have any thoughts on that? I think like they talk a lot about open source models. Again, I don't think they're nearly as good yet. There is a moat. The moat is data, and being able to broker a ton of data.
Yeah.
There's a reason why OpenAI isn't sharing information about how they develop GPT-4. It's like the oddest thing where they release a 100-page report. They're like, this, we share no technical specifications. We just show results. Like, that's what the paper says. Right. And moats are very tricky because like how much money does like the OpenAI or Google have to pay their top AI researchers to not leave and go start something or go join a competitor? So I don't think like knowledge can be contained for that long. But at the same time, their moat is distribution at this point. Like they're just able to get things in front of people very quickly. And there's like the whole idea that monopolies like to act like they're not monopolies a lot of the time. And I think very much around these LLMs, you're going to see kind of an oligopoly of different providers between OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, Microsoft, Inflection, like all these other companies that are coming out as well. It's going to be a quick, it's going to be a race to the bottom. And I don't think it's going to be like an exponentially growing industry. It's going to be a little bit different. It's really hard to build a business from an API, but at the same time, it's like no one else can offer things in a similar way.
Right. That's interesting though. A point you brought up is that right now data is the moat, and so you talked about the cost of like training these models and having access to the training data. I think that this seems to be an interesting area going forward. It seems to me that some companies that own a lot of very valuable data for training these models, so like Reddit, Quora, I think are becoming aware of now the value of this data that they have specifically for training these models, and
Stack Exchange.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Stack Exchange. So they put out a blog post basically saying that they're building some sort of AI system into Stack Overflow. Is that what their plans were? Did you see that? Yeah.
I have no idea.
Totally.
I haven't seen it, but.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Cool. Well, we have just a few minutes left. I guess maybe, is there anything you'd like to talk about that we didn't cover, or maybe you could tell us what you're working on next, or maybe are you graduating this semester? Like, what's the future for you? What does that look like?
Yeah, planning to graduate this quarter. So finish my undergrad, kind of in the +1 masters. Might stick around here for a little bit longer. I think a lot of my friends are, so I think it makes a lot of sense to stay on campus. But probably like, don't know what I'm doing over the summer. Don't know what I'm doing after that. Just trying to spend time exploring, kind of build stuff. I think there's a lot of space to kind of explore right now, and that's kind of what I'm optimizing towards.
Cool. That's a great position to be in. I'm envious, I suppose. Great. Well, what if folks are interested in?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, as far as like other projects and things like that, nothing's kind of planned. Just kind of poking around and seeing what makes sense. Yeah, probably a lot more GPT stuff.
Cool. Well, it seems like this whole space is evolving so quickly that it's kind of difficult to plan a project out even a few months ahead of time, because there may be some advancements that make that obsolete, or things that are much more interesting based on new technology that's emerging. Such a rapidly evolving space. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, 100% agree.
Cool. Well, if folks are interested in following what you're working on, should they check you out on Twitter? I think you have a Substack as well, and we can link all these. But what's the best way for folks to kind of follow your work?
Probably Twitter. Yeah. Pretty much post there for the most part, Twitter or LinkedIn.
Okay, great. We'll be sure to link that in the chat. Yeah, is there anything else you want to say to folks or chat about in our last couple of minutes here?
Not particularly. I think I had a great time kind of chatting about this stuff. Always fun to kind of reflect and kind of practice explaining this stuff because it can seem magical, and I think at its core, it's not. I think when you spend enough time around this stuff, it's there's a lot of patterns you start to see over and over again. But you kind of have to be in a position where you can kind of just play and experiment for a while, which I think I am fortunate enough to do at school. And I just love getting out there and sharing it with other people. So thank you.
Gotcha. Great. Well, thanks so much for joining today. Thanks for building in the open and putting these things out there. It's really inspiring to see. So yeah, thanks a lot. It's great to connect with you, and yeah, hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks everyone for joining today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Will.
Great. Well, for everyone joining, be sure to check out future live streams at neo4j.com/events. Also mentioned that the CFP, the call for proposals for our online conference nodes, is now open. So Varun, hopefully we'll see a submission from you on speaking about something fascinating at nodes. It's in October, so who knows what you'll be working on then, I suppose. Great. Well, thanks everyone. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.